Okay, so for these next couple of videos, I'll be talking about cognitive functions within the cognitive function stack of INTJ, and how I feel there are certain moments and certain things that Sallie said that really exemplified use of those cognitive functions and in the order they're in that type. I'll just repeat for those that don't know, but the INTJ's cognitive function stack is dominant introverted intuition running their show. Then we have the auxiliary function for them of extroverted thinking. Then we have the tertiary function of introverted feeling. And then last in the conscious part of the cognitive function stack, the inferior function is extroverted sensing. And I'm going to go in more or less chronological order as you know through the interview I'm going to refer to the interview that way and the different moments. And I'll start by saying that most of video 2, the first part of the interview, a lot of what Sallie's talking about would apply to introverts generally, I think. But near the end of that video, at the 5-minute 43-second mark, she makes mention of something, and this is pretty iffy. This is really iffy, actually. This is arguably like, this, if someone wanted to wrestle me for this one and make me concede that it's not necessarily expressive of the inferior extroverted sensing function, I would concede. But I'm going to raise it because I think it might be an example of that cognitive function at work in INTJ, who is in midlife, who's up in she said she's in her early 60s. So the kind of progression of development that, of course, there's going to be a huge range for different people, but it's quite often the case that people will really start developing their auxiliary function once they get into their 20s or so. Again, very wide range of variability here. Some people will never really develop more than they will never develop their functions below their dominant function, which you could think of analogically as kind of the operating system for the personality, if you like. And then other people will make just fantastic development through their lifespan. And some of them will, pass a bunch of markers relatively early on in adulthood. But it said that more people will start really exercising more, if they're ever to do so, their auxiliary functions in their 20s, 30s, and then quite often the tertiary function begins to be exercised a little more. Things that are associated with that function that often end up becoming priorities associated with use of that cognitive function will start emerging sometime in the 30s and go into the 40s. And then maybe, for some people, they might in later life start paying more attention to what their fourth function, their inferior function, might suggest to them to, kind of temperament, very, very relatively weak temperamental leaning there that might lead them more to paying attention to things like that associated with that. In this case with INTJ, that would be extroverted sensing. So Sallie did mention a couple of times in the interview something that could possibly have to do with her getting a little more into her inferior function mentally a little more often. Although maybe not. Maybe she's just always been like that. Maybe Sallie's going to tell us. She'll write in comments. I don't know. But she does say that when she's talking about different kinds of exercise that she would like, and what she notices is different versus a lot of other people. She makes mention she needs a really heavy dose of nature, and how much she loves to bike and how she would run if she could. And another thing that I just made the briefest of mention to in the interview itself was something that had come up when we had supper together a couple of days previous. And one of the things that Sallie was really researching a lot was, she was when we were sitting on my back porch, she spent a lot of time trying to figure out what kind of tree was in the backyard. And, it was a real focal point. She was really going into it and discussing, and we all got into it. I had no idea. It never occurred to me to give about what kind of tree it was. It just wasn't something I thought about. but she wanted to classify it, know it, and know, what the different eco zones were. And, we ended up talking about that a bit. And she said that's a thing that she does when she travels. She likes to know what the trees are. And I just thought that was really neat. Again, just an area of knowledge, that's her own thing. And but it could be a little bit. And she also mentioned later in video 4 of this series, there's a point when she's talking with CJ about their bike rides, and I guess her bike rides alone or with other people too. And she made mention of the fact that quite often she notices that she often is a person in a group who will notice the smell of the honeysuckle more. These sort of sensual things in nature she might notice more. And so again, don't know if that's necessarily expressive of extroverted sensing, sort of budding use of extroverted sensing or not. Maybe it has to do with her background, growing up on the farm, maybe, spending a lot of time in the woods as a kid, that kind of thing. I don't know, but could be. All right. Then here was something I thought was could be kind of indicative of dominant introverted intuition. In her case, it was in video 2 near the 5-minute 53-second mark, where I was trying to prompt her to speak of something spoken of previously before the interview, of her what I think is often maybe even introvert typical of sort of enjoying doing something on your own, but in a crowd setting. So again, where you're not having a lot, you get to control the interaction. You're not necessarily having any direct interaction with people, or if you are, it's very light. But you're sitting in a cafe quietly doing your thing with other people around would be an example of that. And Sallie had, again, spontaneously brought that up during her visit. And I was like, oh, listen to this. So I'm trying to sort of prompt that, and I'm fumbling around. I'm not doing a very good job. And I'm trying to elicit her to speak of this. And what she does is she goes right for like what's behind it. What I'm trying to do, now maybe she didn't, maybe this, her going to the meaning or the sort of extension of what we're talking about, maybe that had more to do with the fact I wasn't being clear or communicating, which I wasn't. I was kind of trying to elicit concrete, objective detail about what is this situation. And she had already leapt ahead in her mind and was talking about how, like, what is the purpose of this thing? I was trying to get her to talk about what the thing was and define it for the audience. And she skipped right over that and went right to, this is what it does for me, grounds me. And she thought I was asking about, what is grounding? Yeah, so I was like, that's interesting. That might be a little bit about introverted intuition. Again, always kind of looking at the big picture, looking for themes, like noticing themes, noticing patterns, and then in a very principled kind of way. This is more introverted intuition than my dominant function as an ENFP of extroverted intuition, of sort of, again, searching for the one. That's what NI does. NI is entertaining a lot of different possibilities in a really creative thinking manner, but it's searching. It's searching for what is relevant to its vision, and I thought maybe that was an example of that in action, where that, for her, the main thing was like what it does for you, not the this, what are the little details of the given situation. Then another thing I thought was pretty, I think this would be typical, as we discussed in the interview itself. I think this could be a pretty typical attitude of, I know it is actually, of a lot of people of the intuitive information gathering preference within the MBTI, but also people who, but particularly I think, the introverted creative thinking types, that would be the ones with who have an introverted dominant function, and then have somewhere in the top 2 functions intuition as their information gathering preference. And talking about sort of feeling like about having to, why she wouldn't necessarily prefer exercise class, even if she, likes the class, she wouldn't prefer that as a form of exercise. Because, she went, kind of rolling her eyes, like, like even having to make that kind of chit chat in such a class is like, it's just too much. It just really makes it not a desirable activity for her. She said, if I have to be at the gym, I want to be a machine alone. And I think that's something that a lot of the INs can relate to. Although I do make note of it because I think this is an example of what, again, if it's presents in evidence, it's in evidence with a lot of other supporting evidence for, to argue that someone's identifies more with one type or another. This could be a good part of a good differentiation between INTJ and INFJ, because although I think, based on enormous amounts of responses I've got to my videos and my lived experience and talking to them directly and blah, 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 with INFJs, that many of them would feel exactly the same way. They were like, I hate small talk too. I hate small talk. But I think, though, that INFJs very much more often feel compelled, like it's part of their natural thing because of their auxiliary extroverted feeling and the needing this drive that they have naturally to want to create harmony with the group. And, really, so they may not like small talk, but they will, with less chagrin, less like eye rolling and like, exasperation, they'll still take part in it and do it very well. And I've seen many an INFJ comment in under my videos that sometimes they curse themselves for how well they do it. And that's been funny. Or they're like, maybe I'm too good sometimes. Sometimes I think maybe I'm a little too good, and I wonder to myself, as I observe how well it's going, and I think, like, surely, is this other person, are they as bored by this as I am? I'm pretty bored by this. But they continue to do it and do it well. And the other person probably doesn't know how much they're not into it, really. But, or not for their own just selfish reasons, as separate from others. So, all right, I'm going to make another video. I'll continue talking about the INTJ stuff. But yeah, I thought that was a good example of it too, where Sallie's like, I would rather not even do the class than have to deal with that. And then, I'll just finish. And another place she talks about in video 3, related, where she says, she likes kind of the around the mailbox, chit chat sometimes. But then again, she had this like this big expression of like, I hate that, about having to, she doesn't like it when the situation calls for her to, in order for it to be acceptable and okay, when it calls for her to have to remember all these little, probably I'm guessing what she would consider too, kind of mundane details of other people's lives. Like, again, like how are their children and how is Sallie away at college, at college, and what's, how was that trip to Hawaii you had 3 weeks ago that I'm supposed to remember? Like, she doesn't want to have to remember that, and obviously considers having to meet that standard to be socially acceptable. She considers that a kind of onerous burden that she'd like to just not have to deal with. And again, it's not just INTJs who would be likely feel that way, but, they really particularly would. And I think that makes a lot of sense when you know about the whole type profile. All right, next.